pointed at me without. Thank you.
There you go.
It's preparing, setting up your meeting for YouTube Live.
Yeah.
Meeting is now streaming on YouTube Live. I'm just going to exit the full screen and just see it's redirecting. So I'm just having a look at my YouTube now. Well, I seem to be live. We seem to be live.
That's right.
Good morning, everyone.
Hello.
Hello, whoever's out there.
Whoever's out there. So I'm on the chat. I can see the chat here. So I'm able to respond to people in the chat on YouTube Live. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Whoever has joined us this morning. My name is Dr Tania Perich. I'm a psychologist, researcher and senior lecturer at Western Sydney University. This is our first YouTube webinar. So we're very excited, anxious on my part because I'm trying to run it. And so this is an experiment for us just to see how it goes. So I'm just going to introduce our panel. I'm just going to go around the screen. So I've got David next to me on the screen. David Gilfillan is a clinical psychologist that worked with me at the Black Dog Institute in the past, and he has done a lot of work in the bipolar disorder area. So thank you, David, for coming to our webinar today.
Yeah.
I'm going to introduce also Professor Meg Smith, who is an Order of Australia Medal recipient. Meg was also a lecturer with us at Western Sydney University and is a lived experience advocate and has considerable expertise in the bipolar disorder area. Meg, does that describe you well enough? I'm just talking off the top of my head.
Actually, yes. I think after I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I figured I may as well do a PhD, on it.
As you do. And Dr. Margo Orum as well is also a recipient of a PhD. Margo is also a registered psychologist and lived experience presenter in bipolar disorder. And your PhD, what was your PhD in, Margo? Was it in bipolar disorder or in another?
No, it wasn't actually. I didn't think it was initially, but it turned out that it was actually the PhD topic was moments of insight and ego development. It was just about how we grow and how we update our sense of self. And I thought it wasn't about bipolar disorder all the time I did it. And then for some years afterwards, and then more and more, I realized, hey, this really applies to bipolar disorder. So I'll say more about that a bit later on.
Well, it's a fantastic topic that is very relevant to what we're talking about today. So our theme for our conversation today was love, work and play, how to make a good life while living with bipolar disorder. And Margo, this was your suggestion, this title.
Yes, I guess came from my background interest in psychoanalytic sort of thinking of, Freud's kind of sort of throwaway line or famous saying that how do you live a good life, or what is a good life? And a good life is the ability to love, the ability to work and the ability to play, and to have all those three things accessible to you and possible for you is kind of a description of living a good life. And of course, those things don't mean that you don't have terrible ups and downs at times, or terrible downs and strange ups, but, in the case of bipolar. But yeah, and I think it's really important for people who have bipolar disorder to not see that illness or condition as all that different from many other conditions like, autoimmune illness, disability, heart disease, all these kinds of things are things that impact on loving, working and playing. But with something that's a mental illness that affects our sense of self, then that has a very personal kind of an identity connection there too, that really affects how we see ourselves when we're ill. So I think, that was kind of the idea behind sort of how do we love well, work well and play well when we have bipolar disorder. And not only I, but you and David too, and Meg as well, I think have also met many people who are doing all those things quite well with you know, also managing bipolar disorder. So I want to over to you for that.
Well, it's such a, like, and David and I were talking about this before we started the webinar, weren't we, David? Like, how does bipolar impact on this? Or, you know what I mean? Like, Meg, did you want to say something to that? Oh, you're muted, Meg.
Yes. Well, I think one of the issues about bipolar disorder is that the episodes of illness tend to change over time. So, you know, for example, my first episode was a depression. So I switched from English history to psychology at university, trying to understand what was going on. And then became disillusioned with psychology because I wasn't getting any answers. And then had a psychotic episode. And I think that radically sort of changed me, my sort of worldview. I started thinking, well, okay, what kind of life can I have? Could I actually work as a psychologist or a counsellor? And looked at the stresses I was under and felt that probably not. So that's when I got a job at a university. And like, okay, if you're going to do a PhD, it's kind of good to do it when you're at a university, and you know. So, but I think at the time, this was in the 1980s, bipolar disorder was seen very much of all you have to do is take medication, and if you have an episode, it's because you've stopped taking your medication and you've been naughty. And there was very little research on recovery models or psychological management of bipolar disorder, or even counselling strategies. So I started interviewing people who had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And one of the things that came out of that was that there were a number of life stresses for each of the episodes. So, you know, the last year of high school, for example, quite a few people had their first episode during the last year of high school. Things like marriage breakups, losing your job, you know, family stress and what have you, often precipitated episodes in people who were vulnerable. So I came out of it thinking, well, you know, there's a lot more to it than just taking medication. Sure, the medication can sometimes prevent episodes, and certainly you can manage episodes and make them a lot shorter and much less severe. But there's a hell of a lot of life changes that people need to make. And I guess one of the issues for me was personality changes. That, you know, the person you are when you're severely depressed, particularly for a long time, is quite different from the person you are when you're manic. And I think it took me quite a long time to discover who I really was without, you know, the long episodes of mood swings.
Yeah, it's a lifelong thing, isn't it, Meg?
Well, it's a lifelong thing. And I think, you know, it's certainly affected by, you know, life changes that happen, you know, because of your biochemistry. Like for women in particular, you know, puberty, sexual encounters, pregnancy, postpartum pregnancy, and menopause. So, you know, there's a whole sort of hormonal issue going on there. And again, you know, there really hasn't been that much research into the differences between men and women in terms of the way hormones can affect the types of episodes that people actually have.
I'm going to add to that too. I agree, Meg. And I know that we've done some research looking at the impact of menopause for women with bipolar disorder, and there's very little that's actually been done. So it's very hard for us to know what changes over time and also what gender differences there. I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, Margo. Meg was literally talking about research that we've done. So
no, I've got nothing. I was just nodding.
You were nodding in agreement.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that because it also leads into identity, isn't it? Our identity changes over our life.
Yeah.
And identity is impacted by the changes. That's what I was hearing from Meg's story there. Is it's very hard to know who you are, and that, but also who you are changes over time.
Yeah.
So it's like a double level of changes there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Is that what you were saying, Meg?
Yeah, and I mean, I think some of the decisions I made, like, for example, choosing not to have children, It was a bit difficult because my partner at the time had a vasectomy anyway, so it probably didn't become an issue really. But I think, talking to women who had quite severe postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis, kind of made me realise that, hey, this is a risk factor. The other issue, of course, is it's genetic. There are numbers of people in my family who've either had bipolar disorder or episodes of serious depression. So I'm kind of conscious that there's a genetic link, and and also not knowing very much about that, like how genetic is it? What are the risks in each generation? So there were sort of issues like that. And I think, again, there were sort of issues about work that, sleeping, for example, is really crucial for me. If I don't sleep, I'm at great risk of having another episode. So a job where I'm required to work shift work, for example, would in fact, be quite difficult. For example, I've been on after hours call for my work this week. So, 7 days where you might get a call at 3 a.m. in the morning. Oh. Not that any came in, but, I was kind of conscious that I wasn't sleeping very well, just in case the phone rang. So there are issues like that. Working at a university was ideal in the sense that, it doesn't matter if you're a bit eccentric. But even there, there was a lot of stigma about having a mental illness. And I was in the odd situation once of being in a group of 4 academics, and 3 of us had had serious episodes of mood disorder. And I think the poor person who was the 4th person really had no idea, what was going on. So, but, the other 2 people didn't want to be open about having a mood disorder. So, the kind of hidden stigma, if you like, that it's pretty, I was kind of lucky, I suppose, in the sense that my first job was working at a women's health centre which had a feminist orientation. And, at that stage, Phyllis Chesler was writing books about women and madness, and Artie Lang was talking about, mental illness being triggered by environmental stress. So it was a safe environment to come out and say, yes, well, I've been a psychiatric patient and was pretty unhappy with the system and can see that there were environmental factors that triggered off the episodes.
David, tell us something about that.
Well, I was actually not so much the last part, but about the work situation. My experience of working with people who've done exceptionally well with bipolar disorder has been that they've found work circumstances that work for them. That sometimes means a change in career, otherwise just means adapting within. I think of one person I knew who was a very successful market trader before his bipolar came out. Market trading was high stress, high adrenaline, was the worst possible thing for his disorder. He changed to, within the same organization, to a management role without the same pressures. And it worked extremely well for him. So sometimes a change of occupation or a change of a role within occupation is not a bad thing. And my suspicion when I speak to those type of people often that they're happier with what they ended up in than they would have been if they had carried on with their original plan.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I agree with that, David, that what he did apparently gave him a better quality of life. And I think so much of treating bipolar disorder is about the ordinary personal growth process that any person goes through to have a good life. It's orienting yourself to be a better version of yourself, and not better as in morally better, although sometimes moral integrity develops with a developing sense of self, of what you can do and what you can't do, and making wise choices. But it's a version of yourself that is more peaceful, has more inner peace, that you're more effective in what you do, and also that you're more productive, and yet you're not stressing yourself out. And this is advice that I would give to any person,
I agree.
whether they have bipolar or not, on how to live a good life.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues for me is that being bipolar means that you move from one end of the functioning spectrum to the other.
Yeah.
And certainly before I was diagnosed, I had long episodes of depression, when I reached puberty and later adolescence and then, young adulthood. And the pattern I got into was when I was depressed, everything stood still. But when I recovered from the depression and frankly got a bit manic, it was like I had to work really hard to, do everything that I'd missed out on for the previous year. And the same thing, well, when I had a psychotic episode, I could sort of recognise that, people around me were going through the same kind of stresses, but they didn't get manic and, they very quickly got exhausted and started looking for ways to relax and what have you. And I didn't, I just kept on going. So it's like we don't have an off switch. And of course, during depression, we don't have an on switch.
Yes.
So actually regulating the moods and recognising that being stable, I'm a hell of a lot more productive than when I'm seesawing between periods of hypomania and high activity and long periods of no activity and depression.
If I could add something there, which I think that's, I think you just hit the nail on the head there, Meg. One of the things, of course, is that if you're newly diagnosed with bipolar and you're still at the stage where it's not really controlled, success is actually just looking after yourself at that time. Success depends on how well the condition is controlled, that things are coming together, and it's not always your responsibility. It's a biological condition and it can take time to control. So if you're not being highly successful at work at the moment, it doesn't mean you're failing or in life in generally. It may just be where you are with the condition.
I think the other thing too is the changes in medication. I think when I had my first episodes, it was the 1960s. And the only medications around at that stage were the antidepressants and the antipsychotics. And certainly one of my episodes was triggered by the antidepressants, that the tricyclic antidepressants sure switch you up, but then you get hypomanic. And then, you get hit with antipsychotics, which bring you down into a depression. And there's now evidence that just being treated with antidepressants and antipsychotics actually makes the condition worse, that as you get older, you start to become rapid cycling. So really up and down with very few periods of stability in between. When I was diagnosed in the 1980s, I was put on lithium, which meant that, I had a couple of years of stability and started to learn that, hey, wow, this is what a stable life means. But I had fairly bad side effects from lithium. And, about 70% of people do well on lithium. The other 30%, like me, develop terrible side effects, or the lithium doesn't really work effectively. I'm now taking the motragine and, the other anticonvulsants like sodium valproate, for example, I think have made a huge difference to people's lives. So the medication has got a lot better. And, when I look at, a couple of my family members younger family members who developed a bipolar disorder, their episodes are much shorter. They're certainly not as severe. And that's largely due to the changes we've got much better medications now than we ever have had.
Yes, and Meg, possibly also their learnings from you, having been in the family going ahead of them, and they're learning about the illness from knowing about it from you too. But look, I too have been very happy with how lithium helped me. I was one of the 70% for whom it worked really well for 30 years. I sort of went on at about 33. And the only last two very big sort of psychotic episodes that I had were actually when I was offered the first time from a foolish decision that, oh, I can do without this now that I feel really quite well and everything's okay. Well, once I encountered a big stressful trigger, I did a very high volume personal growth workshop that was just way too much sleep deprivation, too much excitement, too much stimulation, all in one big compacted thing. Boom, I was psychotic. The other time was more a medical thing that happened, that by then, 30 years later, I was, the lithium had started to take a toll on my kidneys. So we were reducing it. And then finally I went off it because I'd been so well for so long. But unfortunately, an episode broke through due to a lot of work stress. And in the outcome of that has been that I've gone back on lithium, then help control and bring down that psychosis. So I because my kidneys had recovered from going off it, then I went back on it to control that psychosis. And then within a month or two, the kidneys were starting to react again. So my psychiatrist put me on another form of lithium. Instead of lithium carbonate, which most people take, she put me on lithium orotate, which is a more natural occurring form of it, and it affects your body differently. And my kidneys have been happy with that. So I now have what I believe is the protection of lithium orotate rather than lithium carbonate, but without the damage to the kidneys. So I'm very happy with that. But unfortunately, there's hardly any hard evidence of good double-blind placebo-controlled studies on lithium orotate because it doesn't serve any pharmaceutical, big bucks to investigate that. But for me and for several people that my psychiatrist has similarly, when people can't tolerate the other form of lithium, she's tried this form and found that good. But we're all just case studies that have done well on it.
I think a point I'd make with what you're both saying there is that it takes time sometimes to get the right medication.
Yes.
And don't despair if it's not working or you're struggling to find the right balance. It can take quite a time to get it right, but there are an enormous amount of variables that can be put together that can help.
I think one of the issues about the medication, and you touched on this, Margo, with the drug companies not willing to do the research if there's not any profit in them for them. I mean, that was one of the issues with lamotrigine, that sure, it's used for epilepsy, but it's not subsidised by the government for bipolar disorder. So when I first started taking it, it was really expensive. It was like each tablet was worth $5, which, if you're on a pension, $5 a day amounts up to about half your pension. So, I found various strategies like, getting the bigger tablets and chopping them into little pieces because the big tablets were the same price as the little tablets. But, lamotrigine is still not covered. Sure, there are now generic versions of it, so it's actually come down in price. But when lamotrigine was first proven to be effective in bipolar disorder, there were numbers of people who contacted me saying, I can't afford to take it. And I remember back in the 80s, in the United States, the National Organisation for Mood Disorders did a survey of their members, and about half the people couldn't afford treatment. And I think that's a real issue for people, that the cheap medications are the older medications. So, in some ways, if you've got insurance, if you're reasonably, well off so you can actually afford the medication, I can afford to go to a private hospital, I can afford more expensive medication. But a lot of people who have had fairly frequent episodes of bipolar disorder or any other mental illness, you can't afford the treatment. We're lucky in Australia, we've got, we've got Medicare, but, when I look at other countries where a lot of people simply can't afford the treatment.
David, you were saying something just recently in our workshop where you work with my staff, and you were saying, for a lot of people with bipolar disorder, or if you take people with bipolar disorder as a group, there's a third. do you want to just say what you describe that?
Okay, I was a bit worried when you said that, Margo, because I can never remember what I've said, but I do.
Yes.
No pressure, David.
I can give the short version of it, but I think you have a bit more background to it than I have.
It's actually really strange. Hippocrates said many years ago, when he was 500 BC, that there was a 1/3 rule in medication, so that 1/3 of people got the right medication right away, with whatever the condition was, and that was fine. Another 1/3 struggled, and you had to play around until you got the right thing. And the final third were the unlucky ones, who was really difficult to find the right medication. And the same statistic is pretty valid today, that 1/3 of people who are diagnosed with bipolar get the right medication right away, and it quite often then has minimal effect upon their life. Another third struggle, the medication works partly, doesn't work, the side effects, etc. There's another third who do struggle, and they're the ones who have the hardest time. And sometimes with that group, the sense is that success is actually living your life despite that. But it's very, very frustrating to see other people doing well, other people getting the right medication, and your body just not reacting in the same way to that condition.
Yeah, and I think that's when that's where the other layers of managing the illness then have to come in, that there's a long journey of finding what else, because medication is so important because of the biological nature of the illness. Medication is one of the absolutely foundation stones of managing this illness, but it goes together with the getting to know yourself, your issues, cleaning up your relationships and things. And everybody in the world who's a human being has relationship problems. Like there's not a person alive on earth who doesn't have some part of the way they function in relationships that couldn't be made smoother and easier by coming to know themselves and understanding the dynamics of relationships and working with those relationships to make them better. And there's also too the sort of the personal growth journey, the spiritual journey of what is life about, what is most important. And that can be very sustaining for people who are going through a lot of hardship, because a lot of times people don't actually start a kind of spiritual journey of personal growth until some terrible hardship happens. This is what I actually found in my PhD. I was very surprised to learn that everybody told me that these big moments of insight, they had these life-changing aha moments, came after a big period of depression or a big period of total despair, when suddenly they saw things a different way. And in most cases, when people have that big kind of life shift into a different direction, they shift from values that are more materialistic and more sort of worldly kind of achievement things to values that are more about cherishing relationships, love, loving and being loved, creating that in your life, seeking that as the higher goal of good relationships, even with it, if it's just smiling at a person when you walk past. It's just that interaction between yourself and others that brings on a good feeling, and learning about creating good feelings that don't go off the chart for if you have bipolar, creating good feelings by enjoying the good feelings that come in and feeling gratitude for those good feelings, and just becoming more aware and able to monitor your feelings, because the feelings and emotions are kind of like the weather for us. They come and they go, they pass through us. And I just want to add in here, I went to the Happiness and Its Causes conference just recently, which was all virtual online. And they were saying about this topic, there was a nice catchy little phrase that somebody gave, and I can't remember who said it, but it was, let it in, let it be, let it go. And the let it in was, let that feeling in. If it's despair or rejection or whatever, let that feeling in. Then let it be, as in be with it, know it's there, acknowledge you're feeling that way, hear the self-talk that is going on with that feeling. And then, most importantly, let it go, let it pass through you and move on. So it's letting it pass on, and not subscribing to it and then, oh, this terrible thing is the way things are always going to be, but this is a terrible moment, and giving yourself self-compassion. So I found that a really profound message at the Happiness and Its Causes conference this year, that there were a few people saying very similar things along those lines.
I think one of the issues for me living with bipolar was not trusting my feelings.
Yes.
That, you know, the first episodes of bipolar are often periods of depression, you know, with probably modulation. And, you know, a lot of people seem to have their first really bad episode in their late 20s, early 30s. And one of the issues about that is that, you know, for me, I mean, my earliest medication, you know, was antidepressants and Valium. And to some extent, the Valium became a real issue because it was actually suppressing the feelings. And one of the things that I found very valuable in counselling was trying to work out what was a normal depression, if you like, you know, your cat dies and, you know, it's okay to feel sad. But actually recognising that, you know, any depressive feelings that last longer than a couple of weeks, maybe it's time to actually start looking at whether or not this is a biochemical depression, you know, which sure may have been triggered by similar stresses, or whether, you know, I've got the resilience to actually recover from that.
I'd like to add to what both of you said with Margo, particularly at the in talking about the life change that happens once you've been through a serious episode. I love working with people with bipolar and with people who've been through deep depression as well, because I think there's a wisdom that comes from that, an understanding of the world which is different from what you get with many other people. And not everybody gets it right. I'm not trying to generalize completely, but time after time I've been amazed and stunned at the depth that comes out of those dark times.
Can you give a sort of example of that, David, what you mean by that?
I think you summed it up very well, Margo. I think it's a sense that people who, for example, have been very materialistic, have looked at themselves, have looked at what life means, have looked at what their life means for other people, and has made them perhaps more empathic, more aware of other people's needs, more aware of society's needs in general. And I always feel honoured actually to work with people such as this, because I learn from them, I think, often more than they learn from me.
I remember Kay Redfield Jamison did a study of, I think it was poets who'd won the Nobel Prize for literature or what have you. And I think it was a really high proportion, like, I don't know, maybe 70% of them had experiences of depression or mood disorder. And the same with some great composers, Handel, I think. And I think there's a bit of an anecdotal story about Handel writing the Messiah during a hypomanic stage. And, you know, he locked himself in his studio, and his wife, you know, left his meals outside the door and whatever. But, and I've actually counselled a few people who, you know, they're in the arts or they're, you know, musicians and what have you. And, you know, for a couple of them, it was like, well, I don't want to take medication because I'm actually much more creative having the mood swings. Okay, and I think that's a choice that, you know, I mean, I think the issue for me with mood stabilisers is it doesn't affect creativity and productivity. But certainly if you're on antidepressants and just antipsychotics, yeah, you know, I can see that those episodes certainly, you know, dampen you down and, you know, numb you, if you like, to what's going, you know, what's actually going on in your life.
Yeah, I think, you know, the whole creativity thing is, it's a hard one, because some people just love their highs so much that they just don't want to take their medication, and yet the highs then create so much havoc for them. And so it does become, for them, they really need to sort of look at it and really make choices about, so how has my life been looking? How has it been, and what I've been doing that's contributed to that? And then what can I do up ahead? Is this likely to bring on what I want for my life? You know, if this relationship's important and yet I'm straining that relationship so much that I may lose it, is my ability to get that really big creative high, but at the expense of my own sanity and perhaps this relationship, is that worth it? And it is hard, because it's such a seductive high. It's such a wonderful feeling to feel so creative and so brilliant, you know. It's so fabulous to sort of have access to that brain that's just so super connected, and ideas and puns and everything's just rolling. So it's very seductive, you know. People pay a lot of good money to have this kind of feeling from other drugs. So it is a hard thing to say to someone, well, you know, this is a choice, and it is an art to finding your way through all of that. You know, I think, Meg, you and I were both asked to write a piece for a journal many years ago, I think in 1990, something like that, when I was just before I graduated as a psychologist, I think it was. And we were asked to write about, should Van Gogh have taken lithium? You know, and we all sort of wrote a different thing to that. And my sort of version was, well, it would have been his choice, but perhaps he might have lived longer and still produced beautiful art, maybe not in such big bursts, but maybe he might have enjoyed his art and enjoyed his life more with medication. And I do believe that my own creativity has not suffered one iota. In fact, has actually been helped by lithium, holding me stable so I could develop it in a more sort of coordinated way. I don't feel that dulling, but I understand that not everybody's the same, and not everybody's chemistry is the same. So different people may have different experiences.
I think another issue is relationships, and certainly I think my first 4 boyfriends, you know, suffered from my mood swings. And I think, you know, given that adolescence and early adulthood is a time when, you know, you're forming relationships and looking at who's compatible with your personality and things like that, you know, sometimes relationships can be colored by the fact that, you know, you're a pretty quiet, depressed person, or a really charismatic, you know, hypermanic person. And then when the mood changes, you know, the relationship changes too. And the other issue, I think, is that, you know, often when people are hypermanic or really depressed, you know, we become really self-centered. So it's impossible to understand or empathise with, you know, partners and friends of how they're finding the mood swings. And I think one of the issues for me was that during long, severe episodes of mood disorder, you know, my friendship networks changed. You know, there were some people who simply couldn't cope with someone who's got mental health issues. There were some people who couldn't cope with the mood swings, and then I was, you know, a totally different personality. And, you know, I don't know whether some people were afraid that it was catching or something like that. But, and I remember reading a book by Belak, you know, it was written in the 1950s before there was any medication for bipolar disorder. You know, and a huge percentage of the people had broken relationships, you know, the marriage breakups and things like that. So, you know, by the time people get the diagnosis, there's often a string of failed relationships behind them. So one of the things I certainly had to work out was, well, you know, what is a mature adult relationship for me? And you know, what you were saying, Margo, how do you repair the relationships that, you know, you've actually damaged?
Yeah.
A client of mine described this beautifully the other day, and he doesn't mind me sharing this. He talked about when he's manic, he says time gets squished. He says, what he means by that, he can see 5 years in the future, in his own words. He can jump and see all these wonderful things. The problem with that is that nobody in the workplace goes with him, and neither does his partner. So nobody else understands where he's going. So that creativity and that, while it may be tremendous, doesn't always carry other people with it. And it can put tremendous pressure on relationships in that situation.
Yes, and also that creativity within a psychotic episode. You know, some of the stuff that I produced in a psychosis many years ago, like in the 30 years ago kind of time, I thought it was hilarious. I was writing these little cartoon joke things and everything. I thought they were fabulous. But looking back on them once I was out of that, they weren't really all that great, you know. And so your insight about how they are, it feels so wonderful. But by the same token, I did write some things during those times that were beautiful, that I still think are really good writing that I did. So it's just sort of like, I sort of often say it's like riding the tiger, you know, or riding the magic carpet, you know, it's like you've got to tame it. You've got to be able to rein it in to use that creativity sort of productively. And I do think that the people who value that creativity in themselves, really the time for that they need to develop that creativity in their well times and not sort of rely on becoming high or hypomanic to be creative. You know, one client of mine too many years ago was saying how he only composes and plays the guitar when he's ill, you know, when he's manic, you know, and so he doesn't want to control the illness because he wants to have that creativity. And I feel that management of the illness, for him, the direction was to learn, you know, to try and give a value to to try and develop his creativity in the ordinary times. That was the message. Develop it in the ordinary times, work on it in the ordinary times. It may be a little bit more plod, but you get to have a well life, you get to keep your relationships, you get to interact in the world, you know. It's a better scenario.
Yeah, I think one of the kind of insights for me, probably when I changed from English history to psychology, was, well, do I really want to be a mad poet living in an attic? I want to have a normal life. And I remember there was a film many years ago about bipolar disorder, and there was a woman who said, yeah, when I'm manic, I write suitcases full of poetry. But I don't want, you know, a life with suitcases full of poetry. I just want to be a normal person.
Yeah.
And I think at the time I thought, you know, that sounds really boring. But now I can see what she meant, you know, that there's so many other things in life besides suitcases full of poetry.
Morgan and I have discussed this before, and I think I may have done it with Tania as well, is that quite often, and you're far better qualified to address this than I am, but you know, when you get depressed, the things you worry about are very often the things that you worry about when you're not depressed. They just take on a different flavour. And I suspect when people go hypermanic and manic, there's a tendency the same way. That, so Margo's point about being creative when you are not an episode is very valid, because you actually can do it, because the things you are creating when you're manic or hypermanic are there in you already.
Yes.
It's just being released at that time.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the issue is you've just got the energy now to sort of bring them to some kind of fruition. Yes. But what you don't have is the judgment and the perseverance to tidy them up and actually bring them, you know, into sort of the real world.
Yeah, and I think there's a real identity thing about all of that, is who am I? Am I the person who is, you know, highly creative when I'm manic or not? Well, as David just said, yeah, it is in you if you're able to do it while you're manic. It's just that you're not inhibited by the usual constraints of eating, sleeping, you know, doing all those things that keep our lives rolling sort of thing. You're just in this fireball of energy and stuff. And so the who am I question, it's a bit similar to when people say, oh, I'm like my mother or my father in this. but the way they are like that, I don't like. So I want to keep that good part of them, but I want to reject or not be like them in this other way. And I think the same applies for relating to yourself when you're manic or depressed. That maybe when you're depressed, you're more insightful too in other ways, where you think more deeply about the meaning of things. So depression is a time when you're a lot more introspective and think and slow down and think more deeply about things. And often it just goes down negative tunnels. That's the problem. But if you can harness that kind of thoughtfulness in depression and harness the creativity in the highs, and just go, well, this part of myself in the high, I'd like to bring that in to my ordinary self. And this part of myself in the lows, I'd like to bring that in to my ordinary self. And we do all make choices, whether bipolar or not. Again, I'd sort of make this point about anybody and personal growth is, do I want to be an angry person? Yes or no? Well, then I'm going to work to manage that anger differently and have a different outcome with it. That's a similar question is, do I want that level of creativity which has these harmful side effects?
Yeah. I think the most profound experiences for me were being involved in a support group for people living with bipolar disorder. And I guess, one of the issues about episodes of severe depression and, severe mania is that they feel horribly unique.
Yes.
They feel like, well, you're the only person in the world who ever thought she was the Virgin Mary, except, of course, for the first one. And then, it's a bit like being drunk, when you meet other people and realise that they do the same thing, similar things when they're low. And then it's like, well, this is part of the illness. This is now not part of me. So figuring out, what is the illness? How do I behave when I'm manic? How do I behave when I'm depressed? How do I feel during sort of episodes? And, working out what's the real me. I mean, for example, one of the issues for me when I'm depressed is I get incredibly irritable, which is a bit of a bugger in a relationship. But I think, everyday things would irritate me. And I remember my sister saying about antidepressants, she called them don't give us stuff pills, which, if you've got a severe depression, the antidepressants do desensitize you to, kind of life stresses that can sort of trigger, send you over the edge. So I think, again, looking at the medications and working out, what works for you, do they in fact prevent mood swings? And certainly when I was terrified of having another episode, I was just so grateful for the lithium as this sort of protection, that I'm not going to have another one of these episodes. But similarly, with the medication I take now, that the antidepressant I take, cuts out the anxiety and the irritability. The lamotrigine protects me against having another episode. And probably like you, Margo, it's like, well, I've been well for so long.
Yeah.
I need to keep taking it. But I think one of the things for me is, I kind of evaluate myself every 3 months and think, well, okay, what's coming up in the next 3 months? Is there going to be a lot of stress? If so, it's probably a good idea to be protected. If I'm going to decide to stop taking the medication, can I guarantee that there'll be a period of no stress? So, I mean, with COVID being around this year, it's like, well, I'm going to stay on the medication until COVID's over.
A question from what you just said there. Do you think it's good for people with bipolar to have a support network of people suffering from the condition?
Absolutely, because I think, even intimate partners, I think it's an unfair burden to put onto an intimate partner, unless, they themselves have, sort of experience of it and what have you. But I think it is important to have a support network of people who will listen, not judge, and actually understand and empathize. But for me, it's also a kind of check of, hey, what I'm feeling now is normal, mood swings. Everybody has mood swings, but it's, how intense they are and what actually happens. So, I think having sensible advice for people who can say, hey, look, you're getting a bit high, you know, how many hours did you sleep last night? You know, what kind of stresses are you under? You know, how's your medication? Are you taking your pills? So actually managing that way. The other thing I think was, you know, picking up on people who actually aren't bipolar. And certainly, you know, I've come across quite a few young people who have been incorrectly diagnosed with bipolar. And it's kind of quite striking when you get into a support group and, you know, over a period of time, you know, you can see, well, I don't think this person really is bipolar. You know, maybe it's time to check it out with a psychiatrist, you know, actually evaluate what the pattern of the disorder actually is and figure out what else is going on in your life.
Yeah, go on. Sorry, David.
I was going to say exactly that point there, going the other way. I, for many years, was the, I'd say I chaired a group of people, virtually all male with bipolar. Chairing meant I said, I welcomed them and I didn't get a word in edgeways for the rest of the sessions. But one of the things that was very, very interesting was how well the group looked after each other and how quickly they picked up. They picked up far quicker than me if someone was starting to swing either way. So it had a very, very good preventative function as well.
Yeah. And I think the support group sort of thing is very important in the early stages in particular. And some people, like some people will like the support group and some won't because it's frightening then suddenly because they're still dealing with accepting the diagnosis. But in general, I think the support group helps to normalize that, yes, this kind of thing happens. And I think there's a learning phase about the illness that when first diagnosed, people need to learn about the illness, understand it, understand how it affects them. And so that's when a support group is a really good idea. Sometimes people may stay too long in support groups though, and might be better off in an art class or something else that helps them feel more normalized after a while, that once they've learned that stuff, they don't need to keep going all the time, you know. I think it's good if there's a kind of revolving door of that kind of thing where new people coming in, getting sort of trained up or educated about the illness with the support groups, but then also, you know, furthering their journey through other means as well and not getting kind of stuck in a support group and in a kind of us against the world kind of way.
Yeah, the support group I started back in the 1980s, you know, went through a number of stages. I mean, a lot of us were very angry about the treatment we'd received or not received. A lot of us, you know, had no information from the hospital or it was just like take your medication and that's that. But I think what worried me was that people, you know, formed my identity as manic depressive. It was known as manic depressive illness in those days. And that concerned me because it was like, well, this is all I am. I'm manic depressive. You know, people weren't. And I think the group eventually got a reputation as being, you know, we had it on Sunday afternoon. We provided afternoon tea. It was a pleasant outing. So for people whose, you know, relationships and friendships had been severely damaged and they were very isolated, you know, it was a kind of, you know, social get-together. But for people who really wanted to learn about it and move on, you know, it really wasn't appropriate. And the Mental Health Association did a study of support groups back in the 90s. And one of the striking things that came out of it was that, you know, the average member was, you know, a woman in her 40s who, you know, kind of, you know, probably the social interaction was kind of pretty important. But a lot of the people were saying, look, it's just re-traumatising, you know, new people coming in talking about how terrible their treatment has been. You know, to hear that, I've moved on. So I agree with you, Margo, you know, it's important to say, okay, I've now learned about the illness. And sure, you know, with YouTube and the internet, it's now possible to learn a hell of a lot more without having to go along to a support group. Yeah, the other issue I think we found with support groups was that we started, trying to get support groups established in a number of areas. But it was really not easy to do it in rural communities or, regional towns, because people were terrified of being identified.
Yeah.
And, we had a support group at Gladesville, and we were discovering that people were travelling long distances to come to the group at Gladesville because nobody would know them. There still is that kind of stigma. And okay, I think it's okay to be private about it. Not everybody needs to know.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I think if we're all quiet about it, nobody gets to understand out there either.
Yeah. I think it's those who can speak about it and those who aren't good on the public speaking don't need to. It's that's a personal decision of how much am I going to reveal this to the world, and when do I tell this potential partner. When I first met my husband, I went out with him for 3 weeks, or 3 times we went out together or something, before I told him about it, because to him, I seemed like a perfectly normal person. So that it was like, it wasn't, well, he just didn't really understand it, I think, he just thought, oh, well, okay, it's in the past, fine, but in a sense, I've always kind of joked that it was uninformed consent by him, because, we got together. He thought I was, like I am now, and so he thought, okay, so she's had this thing. Well, that's a bit strange, but anyway. And then it was, we got together, and 9 months after we married, I had this big episode after I did that workshop I spoke of, and he saw me psychotic for the first time. Well, that was a real shock. And if he hadn't known, if I hadn't told him about it, that would have been it was terrible. It was traumatizing for him to go through that. And so, it's important. We have to tell someone at some point, but where is that point? I think it's a good idea, if someone has bipolar, to allow themselves to be known as a person first, and then choose a time when we're not too deep in, to reveal that they have this illness, because it does affect your personality when you're in an episode. And your partner can be, responsible for looking after you in those times. Peter's been lucky in that he's only had a very few times of that across my life, because lithium has been very good to me. Sorry, David, you're going to say something there.
I was going to say that I think this is one of the hard parts of having bipolar. Is there a number of decisions that you don't have to make with other people? Do I tell my employer? Don't I tell my employer? If I tell people at work, who do I tell? Do I tell my friends? Which of my friends need to know, which don't? Meg, you referred to having children. Do I have children? Don't I? And so on. These are decisions that many other people don't have to do in the same depth or the same way.
Yeah.
And I think in those situations, support and help are particularly valuable in making the right decision about what you do.
Absolutely.
Well, everyone, I need to interrupt, I think, because we've almost been talking for a full hour.
Right.
And I love listening to everyone share all their different thoughts and ideas. We've covered so many great topics today that I think are just so interesting and important for us to think about and to talk about. So thank you, all of you, for sharing all of your different experiences and knowledge and experience. I think this is going to be really useful for the people on YouTube that come across our channel and want to learn a bit about this. Does anyone have any other final thoughts that they wanted to share with the viewers on YouTube?
One resource I wanted to just mention is Rick Hansen is a psychologist who has a newsletter called Just One Thing. If people look up Rick Hansen in that newsletter, he just has a lot of lovely personal growth advice. It comes through once a week or something. And for anyone who wants an ongoing stream of good advice for personal growth, that's one easy way to get it. Join his newsletter. Rick Hansen, Hanson.
Thank you, Margaret. Meg, did you want to say anything?
muted now.
Oh, good.
Yeah, there's an organisation called Bipolar Australia, and they've got a website, so check out Bipolar Australia, which grew out of the support group in the 1980s. And that's actually moved away from, they still got a support group, but, we're now starting to look at, social action, lobbying for change, increasing, public education about mood disorders.
Fantastic. David, did you want to say anything?
Well, I wanted to say thank you, Tania, first of all, for organising this.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tania.
And also just to say that there is help, there is support, and maybe help's the wrong word. There are people like you doing well or have learned to cope. They've learned life's lessons with it. And they're wonderful assets, and let's use them.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Now I have to figure out how to stop it. So, so it's just me learning how to use YouTube.